Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Bertie harrison-broninski, and today I'm talking with Wijnand Stoefs, carbon removals lead at Carbon Market Watch, about how EU law is developing around greenhouse gas removals.
It's full of industry, it's full of commercial concerns, it's full of vested interests. And when we challenged the Commission on that, and they said, okay, there's voting, so if any decision needs to be made, there will be a vote. And we said, well, business interest will outvote everybody else, so this seems to not be the right way forward. And they said, well, we'll make sure there is no vote.
I began by asking Wijnand to explain what exactly we mean by carbon removal and give us an intro to the topic.
It's an extremely wide field, but there are many things in there that we've been doing for thousands of years. Humanity knows how to do these things. There's many things that we've been thinking about for the last 10, 20 years, and we're seeing first installations popping up, and some of them are 5 or 10 years old. But so it's a very broad range. And in general, people talk about two subcategories. They talk about the nature-based ones. That's the so-called negative emission practices. These are things that sequester carbon in soils, in biomass, in plants, in oceans, sometimes as well. Some people see that as nature-based. So that's anything that uses natural processes to increase the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. So that's the nature-based side. That's planting trees. That's the poster child of the nature-based practices, is planting trees. And on the other side, we have the technological processes, which is where we have engineered solutions. People way smarter than me sat down and thought to themselves, how can we filter carbon from the atmosphere? There's two poster children there. There's direct air capture in CCS. That's called DACS. Direct air capture means that you actually filter ambient air and get the carbon out of there, or as much as you can. You can never filter all of the carbon out, but you can actually filter carbon out of ambient air. It's very energy intensive. We also have BECCS, which is bioenergy in CCS, which is a far more controversial technology, and for a very good reason. It, in essence, means you burn biomass and you capture the carbon that is released while you burn it, and you bury that carbon. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been very clear about the 3 key reasons why we need removals. One is because it helps us to peak atmospheric concentrations of CO2 earlier. The more we remove now, the lower the peak will be, and therefore the lower temperature increase, the lower the tipping points we reach, the lower impacts, devastating impacts of the climate crisis that we will witness. The second is, if we ever want to reach a net zero or climate neutrality globally, then we need removals to compensate for our residual emissions. We will have emissions. There will be sectors that will continue to emit. That has to be the lowest possible. That's very important. So emission reductions are the primary focus, but we need removals to compensate for those residual emissions that we'll have in 2045, 2050, that kind of period on a global level. And the third thing is we need to reach negative emissions. We need to be able to remove more from the atmosphere than we're putting into it, because we've got 2 centuries of pollution that we've put up there. It's causing havoc on our climates, on ecosystems across the planet. So we need to reach net negative emissions to start undoing that process, to start cooling down our planet, to get to a more stable and safe environment.
So the EU is currently developing this new legislation on carbon removals, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework. Do you think there's still a need in that legislation to actually define the differences between some of these categories, like removals and reductions, or nature-based versus engineered?
Yes, definitely. That is a first baby step towards understanding what is actually removal. Because so far, we're not being very good at establishing what is a removal, how does it work, what kind of impacts would we see, where does the system end? I mean, if for BECCS, you have the biomass needs to come from somewhere. So you've got a very broad system because you're harvesting biomass, but you also need to take care of the forest potentially that it comes from, if you're talking about forest waste residues, etc. So we haven't been very good at that. And the certification mechanism is supposed to kind of be a baby step for the EU to understand what are these impacts, how do we estimate them, how do we quantify them, how do we address them once we know what they are, because it is important that we don't sacrifice other things for our removals. We shouldn't be sacrificing European forests to do more removals, or small-scale farmers whose lands will be bought up to do more reforestation, etc., etc. We need to take these social and environmental consequences into account and address them before they do actual significant harm. The voluntary carbon market you mentioned is not being very good at this. So the vast majority of what's in the voluntary carbon market right now is nature-based solutions. So that's reforestation, afforestation, things of that type. Also, there's a lot of confusion there because there's a lot of avoided deforestation. So that means less emissions that are labeled as a removal, which is not the same thing. If you emit less, that's not the same as you're doing a removal. Removal is actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere, not putting less into it. And so the voluntary carbon market has been very bad at looking at this. And many of these nature-based projects, and you've seen the scandals, The Guardian came out with, and also Follow the Money had a good scandal. South Pole is now in the middle of a huge scandal. It's clear that the voluntary carbon market has not been very good at dealing with these, making sure that they are robust projects that actually deliver for the climate and don't have massive impacts on local communities and ecosystems.
And what have the EU done to date in a policy context on removals? I'm thinking of things like the Innovation Fund or the Sustainable Carbon Cycles Communication.
The key thing is the LULUCF regulation. That's land use change, and forestry. That's an actual active regulation. I think it's been in place since 2015, could be earlier. And that actually looks at how much net removals happen in the land sector in Europe. So I'm saying net removals because it also contains emissions. So if you have a forest that burns down, those emissions are also counted there. But it's about looking at the whole land sector and making sure that that land sink increases over time. So there is quite a lot of policy there. It's not perfect. There's not a lot of data. There's lots of loopholes that countries can use. It's with country level targets. So it's definitely not a perfect process. But there is some experience there. But we don't really have experience when it comes to the technological removals. We have you mentioned the Innovation Fund. There is a potential for negative emission projects to be funded through the Innovation Fund. And there's one that's receiving money that's in Stockholm. There's a small scale BECCS plant that uses forestry residues that is being funded by the Innovation Fund. But that's kind of how far as it goes. The Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication you mentioned, that doesn't really contain anything. It's supposed to be a strategic vision document, but there's very little meat to the bones in that. To me, it doesn't feel like a mature vision on how removals would work in Europe. We've got now a proposal from the Commission that's going through the Parliament and the Council called the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, the CRCF. That's actually the first real policy that we have that works on this. And that gives us a bit of an idea of how would it function. But one key question is being ignored, and both in the Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication and in the CRCF, and where do these removals end up? How do they fit into the broader climate framework? Do we get a target for them? Are they used as offsets? We don't have an answer to that on a policy-making level yet from the Commission, but I can tell you that member states and parliament groups are going to seek to answer that question in the current framework, in the current discussions on the certification framework, because it's just a core question. Once we create removals, how do we use them?
I do want to follow up on that and ask you about Carbon Market Watch's position on that in a second, but maybe first, could you just tell us, what stage have we got to with the CRCF?
So it came out in November 2022. It's a proposal. And so now we're end of March 2023. The council has met a few times. So that means representatives from the member states have come together to discuss what's in this proposal. What do they think of it? At the moment, they haven't really had very technical discussions on the nitty gritty. They have been doing back and forth with the Commission with long pages of questions for the commissioners to answer, which I think is not a good sign, because it means that the proposal was maybe not as clear as it should have been. They've also had one council meeting. So that means that the actual ministers of environment or climate came together. That's happened in the middle of March. And they had a 2-hour session on the CRCF. In general, they were stating very basic positions like, we don't want this to be used for greenwashing. We want this to be robust. We don't fully understand completely how this or this would work. We're hoping that by the end of next week, we'll actually have a bit of a better overview of what countries really think. There is still a fight going on. I'll try to explain how this works. So the European Parliament has MEPs, so members of the European Parliament, direct representatives of the European people. They come together in topical committees. Like there's an environment committee, and the environment committee handles climate change. But there's also an agricultural committee that handles agriculture. There's an industrial committee, industry, energy and technology, that covers industry. And so these three committees are in a bit of a tussle who gets to be responsible for which parts of this file. It's clearly a climate file. So ENVI, the environment committee, will be largely in charge. That's for sure. They have already agreed with ITRE, that's industry, on a few shared competences on some small things that might be important for SMEs and small businesses, etc. That all seems fine. But there's a big fight between the agricultural and the environment committees on who is in charge of something called carbon farming. Carbon farming is a very broad thing that in essence means anything that takes up the carbon, be it soils, vegetation, biomass, anything that's these nature-based solutions, that falls under carbon farming. But because it has farming in the name, the Agricultural Committee thinks that it's mainly about farming, but it's actually mainly about forests and peatlands, rewilding and ecosystem protection. It's mainly about those things. But because it says carbon farming, the Agri Committee is up in arms to make sure that they have exclusive competence on it, something that they won't get, but they seem to be convinced that they might. So there's still a bit of a fight happening there, which means that on a technical level, not much has happened. There's a rapporteur. She's from EPP, so that's a center-right party. She has been very tight-lipped about this, and she's holding her cards very close to her chest. We don't know what she wants. We don't know what she sees, where she sees this going, but she will be the person who is ultimately responsible for getting compromise in the parliament, for getting her own position on paper, then seeing if she can get others to agree to it. And so we're hoping that by the end of next month, we will have a clear position from her and we can have proper discussions, something on paper. But at the moment, we're still waiting for her to set those first steps. It's going very slowly, a bit too slowly, because next year is also European elections. And so it's a bit of a gamble on what's going to happen then, because if the key people in the European Parliament get voted out, then who takes over the file, and will they agree to continue along the compromises that are already been found? Or is it going to be a completely new approach? People in the Parliament tell me that normally they just continue as is. So anything that's agreed upon continues to be agreed upon. But if a large majority of the MV committee changes, then the people who actually voted on it are no longer there. I hope that we at least have a position from the Parliament before the next European elections.
If we go back to what you said earlier about the purpose of it and what the certification will be used for, I think there are probably two conversations there. One is about this idea of splitting removals and reductions targets or integrating them. And the other is whether the certification is used in the emissions trading system or on the voluntary carbon market or that kind of thing.
It's more the one and the same issue. It's how are removals used in Europe? We know clearly how much our emissions currently are. We have very good yearly inventories. We can keep a close eye on how our emissions changing, but we don't have that on removals yet because we don't have any technological removals. I mean, there's in Iceland a plant that does 4,000 tons a year. That's not much. If you think that current EU emissions are still around 3.5 to 4 gigatons, we're talking about technological removals being very, very small scale right now. And on the LULUCF side, there's many data problems. So there we don't know either really. So we don't really have any experience with how are we going to use removals? How much are they going to be in 5 years time, in 10 years time, in 20 years time? And where are they going to end up? And it becomes a very important topic. It's definitely the most important part of the removal discussion is where do we use them? How do we use them? There are several ways we can use them. We can use them to what you mentioned, integration into the ETS. That would mean we use them to compensate directly one-on-one with certain emissions. Whoever wants to, who is emitting, can buy a removal and use that to claim that their emissions are no longer relevant because they bought the removal. We think that's fundamentally wrong. And we think that's really the worst way to go about this. From our perspective, removals are a public good. They need to be they need to be incentivized as a public good, used as a public good. We need to reach net zero climate neutrality as a society, as an economy, as a continent. That's what matters, not my individual goods or individual factories or individual companies. That really doesn't matter that much. And so we see this really big push towards net zero claims, net zero products, companies saying that they are going to be zero emission or climate positive, we even hear, using offsets. And that would be what integration in ETS would mean. We would be using removals as offsets. We would be saying an emission and removal are the same thing and we can cancel one out with the other. And that's wrong. From a scientific perspective, they are not the same thing. Any emission which is offset with a removal is actually allowed to continue. We give you a get out of jail free card, while actually the pressure needs to be on every single emission to get as low as possible. And removals need to be a complement, not a substitute. So we need them on top. The IPC is very clear about that. We need our removals on top of deep emission reductions. So we can't equate them. We can't offset. We can't integrate them into the ETS because that would all establish an equivalence which doesn't exist and which from a scientific point of view would be more harmful than good. So that's something that we're very skeptical about. And we hear a lot of noise about ETS integration. We really think this is a really bad idea. And I'm keen to have a one-on-one discussion with someone who can actually explain why it is a good idea. Because I think the main reasons why people want it, they are unwilling to express in public. And that main reason is it's simply cheaper to offset than it is to reduce your emissions. It's cheaper to buy low quality so-called removals. Think of soil credits, things that are very easily reversible. They're way cheaper than actually paying the price for your pollution. And I think that's why people want ETS integration. They don't want to pay the price for their pollution. That goes in directly against EU convention, EU treaties even, where there's a clear principle, the polluter pays, and we should not use removals to undermine that principle.
The first thing people are going to ask, I imagine, when you put that position forward is, okay, so how do we pay for removals? So what alternative kind of financing would you propose?
It's interesting that when it comes to removals, we hear the question constantly, where should the money come from? Who's going to pay for this? But when it comes to other things in the climate sphere, the demands for public subsidies are overwhelming. CCS, hydrogen, it's as if we can just turn on the money tap and pay for these things. We've got a hydrogen bank now in Europe. The Innovation Fund is just only going to do CCS and hydrogen, it seems. There's going to be the Net Zero Industry Act, a few more billion that's going to be tossed at this. That's for anything that would help companies pay less in the EU ETS. That's fine. The public purse will pick that up. But as soon as we talk about removals, then everybody's like, yeah, no, this is not something the public should be paying for. It's clear that offsetting is the way forward. Otherwise, we can't incentivize these things. They're trying to get the cake and eat it. They don't have to pay for the ETS and somebody pays for their emission reductions. And then on the removal side, there's no money left, seemingly. I'd say, no, that's wrong. I think the removals can be paid for. And I think ETS revenues is a clear way forward. From my personal perspective, I think the ETS, there would be a certain poetic elegance to polluters paying into the ETS and society as a whole using that to clean up the atmosphere. So I'm not talking about direct integration. I'm not talking about you can buy a removal and suddenly you're not responsible or liable for your emissions anymore. I'm talking about everybody pays for their emissions and we use that to fund removal technologies like through reverse auctioning systems. Like we have a carbon central bank, for example, that has X amounts of billions in assets. They shoot out tenders saying we want to buy removals in certain technologies or practices. We're looking for this quantity. How much would you ask? What would be your cost to do this for us? That kind of reverse auctioning scheme. I think the ETS can fund a part of that. I think when it comes to many of the nature-based things, which we need, not necessarily as removals, because they are very bad removals, and some of them are definitely not removals. So if you store carbon in soils, it's extremely vulnerable. It's very reversible. We don't really know how much would be in the soils. We don't know when it would be released. The MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification, is extremely complex and expensive and labor intensive. So those are very bad removals, but we need them anyway because not only do they have a climate benefit, but they mainly have what in the climate sphere is very disrespectfully called the co-benefits, but it might actually be the real benefits: biodiversity, soil quality and health, water retention. So a lot of that is also adaptation to climate change, very important. So adaptation benefits and biodiversity benefits. Those things are the actual benefits of these nature-based solutions. And there we actually have two schemes that should be able to fund this. We have the Common Agricultural Policy, which has 155 billion over the 23-2027 period for climate and environment investments. That's 155 billion. The Innovation Fund is 40 billion up to 2030. So, I mean, we're talking about a huge pot of money. The VCM is 2 billion right now, a bit over 2 billion a year globally. So, I mean, the Common Agricultural Policy should be able to really pick up the slack there. And there's no excuse why we can't use it. And on the other side, on the more forestry side, so less the agriculture, but more the forestry side, we have the LULUCF regulation in Europe. We have member state targets on what they have to reach under that regulation. So there is pressure on them to do these actual investments in the forestry sector to help landowners transition to more climate friendly and environment friendly practices in that sector. We had very clear outcome from the ETS reform last year that actually the Innovation Fund has to do negative emission or removal projects as well. So we have a pot of money there. It's not a lot, but then if we want that to be more, we just have to get rid of free allocation in the ETS, and the Innovation Fund will suddenly become a far bigger beast. That's, I think, where the funding should be coming from.
A bit of a side note, perhaps, but you wrote an article recently setting out those views about carbon farming, and you mentioned at one point a kind of scheme in France that hadn't worked so well, where a lot of the money hadn't actually ended up going to the farmers. I was interested just to ask you to tell us a bit more about that.
So it's called the label Bas-Carbone. It's a French voluntary mechanism that focuses not just on removals in the agricultural sector and forestry sector, but also on emission reductions. It's an interesting scheme because the French government is heavily pushing for the CRCF, so the EU level legislation, to be a carbon copy of their scheme. They're doing a lot of advocacy, and actually yesterday afternoon they had an event for climate attachés, so the representatives from the member states, to explain why the label Bas-Carbone is so fantastic and they should just all go along with the French position and just change the whole scheme to be the exact same as the French scheme. But we've heard a lot of skepticism, and for good reason. Lots of member states are very concerned about this French position, and for good reason. The label Bas-Carbone is simply not such a good scheme. And so RAC France, a big environmental organization in France, has done quite a few in-depth reviews of this system, tried to keep an eye on it and explain where it's going wrong. So the climate impacts have been very, very small, kind of can be ignored. And most of the money has not indeed gone to the foresters and the farmers and the landowners that it's supposed to help. They've received about 60% of the funding, and about 40% has been lost along the way to them. A part of that is administrative burden. There's really no way around that. But a large part, about 35%, is just intermediaries, just market actors, verifiers and traders. And it's not a very good scheme if you're trying to support your farmers to do a transition to a climate friendly future. If more than a third of your money is just like getting lost along the way, it doesn't make for a very effective scheme. And so we're definitely hoping that the EU doesn't copy that aspect of it. But there are other problems with it as well. It works on carbon intensity targets. So you can actually have increasing emissions while still receiving funding. So there is a potential for incentivizing just increased intensity of agriculture rather than a climate friendly agriculture, which is a very bizarre way. So you could be paying for a farmer to actually increase their emissions rather than reducing their emissions. And there's many technical issues that was like bad baselines and bad MRV, and nobody actually gets checked. It's a bit of a Wild West happening in France right now.
I also wanted to ask you about biomass and BECCS and how that fits into all of this. In a few of the points in your policy briefing on the CRCF, you seem to be suggesting that BECCS shouldn't be used as a certified removal. And the German Environment Agency's paper that mostly had similar recommendations to yours did say that a little bit more explicitly, but you did say that biomass is not carbon neutral. You had a point about needing good carbon accounting principles and pointed to BECCS. So maybe you could just set out your views on what BECCS's role is in carbon removals going forward.
BECCS, like all the terms here, is a very broad set of concepts and technologies. In essence, it means anything where you use biomass, you burn it and you do CCS, so carbon capture and storage, on your exhaust, and therefore you capture your carbon that was in your biomass, and then you can store it underground for a few millennia and hopefully longer. So it's a very wide range of things, and it all depends on where does the biomass come from. In the UK, there's a plant called Drax, which is probably the worst of the worst in terms of BECCS, and it's something that I hope very strongly that the EU does not copy, that nobody tries to invest in this type of business case in Europe. They're literally just deforesting. I mean, they've been caught using protected forests in British Columbia, I believe, in Canada. So they have been caught actually using biomass from ancient forests, which is very weird. I mean, they're burning forests for the climate. A lot of their biomass comes from the southeast of the US, Georgia, where there's a lot of environmental racism happening. I mean, they're putting their processing plants in very poor areas, mainly people of color areas, lots of health impacts, lots of local environmental impacts. And the fact that they continue to pretend that they're doing their best and they continue to defend their practices shows that they don't really understand what's wrong with their own business model. And they should just be saying mea culpa and cleaning up their supply streams. So that's an example of what really the worst. And that's definitely what we don't want to see. We don't want to see an increased demand on biomass, especially forests, especially ecosystems, that we use that biomass and burn it to create energy and negative emissions. I think that is a devastating way forward. But then the question comes, where should the biomass come from? If you take biomass from the agricultural sector, crops, you would grow energy crops like rapeseed and stuff like that. You would grow that and burn that. But then you're also creating competition for agricultural land, potentially having impact on food prices, both in Europe and internationally. And a lot of the world is still in a very precarious situation, or even in a devastating situation when it comes to availability of food. We definitely don't want Europe to be investing in something that could make that worse. And that's a mistake we made with the biofuels debate 10, 15 years ago, where we actually caused an increase in global food prices because we were buying biomass to use it as biofuels. So we don't want to do that for removals either. We don't want to create an additional demand for agricultural land. So where does the biomass come from? And I think there's only really a few sources, and that's waste from food processing industry. So waste that just at the moment gets composted or gets turned into biogas, things of that type. In Belgium, a lot of it is turned into biogas, but in Denmark, they have extremely high rates of biogas production. There's a potential for some biomass there. Is it fully sustainable? Probably not, because anything that comes from livestock, in Denmark, that's pig farms, anything that comes from livestock production has another environmental impact. So just to pretend that if we use the manure from livestock and then we make that negative emissions, then suddenly the livestock sector is still a net emitter. So there are also questions to be raised there. There is also forest and paper industry waste. So that's from point sources that are already existing, plants that process wood into either furniture or planks or even paper and pulp. That's another source. That's a source that's already available. But again, there is the question, do we really want to incentivize demand for biomass, because that's in essence what we might be doing in the long term. Right now, these are point sources of waste that exist, but will we be incentivizing them and creating more waste because there's money to be had on the removal side? And that's definitely something we don't want. Plus, it's better for our forests if you actually leave these residues, or at least a significant proportion of them, in the forest rather than pulling everything out. It's better for the resilience of those forests. There's also municipal waste. I mean, if you eat a banana, you have a banana peel. There's carbon in that banana peel. So if you would burn the banana peel, there are a few grams of carbon that you could store. But then we're starting to look at like very, very small sources of biomass. And I think that's a key thing for BECCS that people should take home with them is, if we do sustainable BECCS, it's not going to be in the thousands and thousands of millions of tons that the IPCC and other integrated assessment models predict. We have some very crazy numbers about like 16 gigatons of CO2 annually stored underground by BECCS in 2050 in some of the assessment models. Like, we're never going to reach that scale in a sustainable way. I mean, Europe is going to be a few tens, a few hundreds, maybe millions of tons, and that's going to be it. We're never going to reach gigaton scale here. And we're part of a research project that has looked at some of the questions around this, stating how much BECCS can we actually do sustainably. And their conclusion was practically zero, because as soon as you start talking about, you don't want to use ecosystems. You don't want to use anything that's a protected forest or anything. You don't want any biomass from there. Okay, so that's already a lot that goes away. You don't want to create increased pressure on existing forests that are being used. Okay, so there's another source of biomass that disappears. You don't want to create pressure on water use. Okay, that's a few more areas that cannot be used for biomass production. You don't want any competition for agricultural land, etc. And they have a whole list of conditions. And as soon as you start putting these conditions in place, you very quickly get to practically zero biomass that is actually available for BECCS. And that, I think, is a reality that many policymakers in Europe don't understand.
I mean, do you think there's any chance of getting the certification framework to recognise this properly after this? Just this week, we've had the Renewable Energy Directive basically ignore the European Parliament's concerns about woody biomass and all of these things, and it's still counting as renewable.
Yeah, and it's such a politicized question, because there are countries that produce this biomass and they don't want to have any message that would undermine their own sectors. And what you mentioned in the beginning about that we have a position on biomass not being carbon neutral, I mean, this is just a lie. In some cases, and Fern has done some fantastic work on this. Fern is an environmental organization that focuses on forestry. They've done some fantastic work that shows that actually woody biomass is actually worse for the climate than coal. Don't burn it. That's the last thing you should be doing. The environmental impacts are just so much larger. But these countries have big forestry industries and they don't want to undermine their own industries. And I think that's a very short-sighted view. I hope in the certification framework we can mitigate the damage somewhat, but it's going to prove very difficult to get around this carbon neutrality for biomass. But there are some sustainability criteria that have been put in place. So any removal project would not be allowed to have negative impacts on a set of environmental criteria. But there are no social safeguards at the moment, so we're hoping to implement those, but let's focus on the environmental ones. And like one of them is like biodiversity, ecosystem resilience, water use, etc., like climate change adaptation, all those type of things. Any BECCS that's based on forest biomass will never, ever reach those sustainability criteria. And at the moment, as they've been stated, they're fairly weak. But BECCS on forest biomass is so harmful that it won't even reach these very weak criteria. We are hopeful that we can manage to not get them watered down anymore, but even strengthened, because they do need to be strengthened. Even if they stay in their current shape, we are fairly confident that large-scale BECCS based on forest biomass will have no place in Europe. As it shouldn't, by the way. Let's be very clear about that. It's not just a policy question. It's mainly an environmental and social justice question.
We've covered a lot of the broad topics in the carbon removal certification framework, but I did want to give you a chance as well to comment on some of the specifics in the proposal text. Are there issues around how the law is actually being worded?
It's extremely vague. There's so many concepts and principles that are raised, but never really operationalized. We don't know how you would use them. Like there's a thing such as additionality and baselines. They've got some paragraphs on that, but none of these paragraphs actually state what will happen. None of the states, this is the way forward. This is how we see it. It's all about one potential option is this, and we would see something going in that direction. For instance, liability. It's a very important concept. If you do a removal and it is reversed, that can happen to all types of removals. Even if you store in geological formations, there is a potential for leakage. It's fairly small, and I think by now the science is fairly clear that it is a good storage opportunity. But you shouldn't take it for granted. We do still need to monitor it. But if you store in carbon in soils or in vegetation, I mean, you could have a drought or a flood or a forest fire, a pest, etc. There are 1,000 things that could cause leakages from nature-based removals. And so you need a liability. If you have been paid to store carbon and it is reversed, then who is responsible for this? Does it need to be redone, or do you need to buy a new unit or whatever? There has to be some liability. And the Commission proposal simply states there will be an appropriate liability mechanism. But what is appropriate? I think that's a very core issue to just leave for such vague wording. We need to know what is appropriate. And the Commission, they put a lot of faith into in an expert group, and we're members of this expert group. This expert group is supposed to support the Commission when it comes to filling out these blanks, like really fleshing this out over time, taking a few years through it's a process called delegated acts. Like we fill in this, we flesh this, we put more meat on the bones of this proposal over the next 3-4 years. And the expert group is supposed to support the Commission. But this expert group is really flawed. It's full of industry. It's full of commercial concerns. It's full of vested interests. And when we challenged the Commission on that, and they said, well, okay, there's voting. So if any decision needs to be made, there will be a vote. And we said, well, business interests will outvote everybody else. So this seems to not be the right way forward. And they said, well, we'll make sure there is no vote. And even if we lose a vote, we can ignore anything that comes from the expert group. It's a bit of like a weird circular thinking. Like, we don't want to put this on paper right now because we want the expert group to help us. But if the expert group doesn't do what we want them to do, we'll ignore them. So why didn't you just put on paper in this proposal what you wanted in the first place? And then we can have a democratic process to look at this and make it better, or sharpen it where we need to. They're avoiding a lot of the scrutiny from the other institutions by postponing everything for delegated acts. A key mistake is the whole thing looks at very different types of removals. As I mentioned before, removals are a very broad set of technologies and practices. So it looks at carbon farming, anything that's in the nature-based or in the land use sector. It looks at carbon storage and products. Nobody's been able to give me an example of a good carbon removal product, and I don't think they actually exist. But they might in the future, but they don't exist yet. And then technological removals like direct air capture. They're all three seen as the same thing. While one of them, like direct air capture and storage, that has storage of up to several millennia, if we do it right. Storage in soils, 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years, if we're lucky. We cannot equate this type of storage timelines and this type of quality of removal. We can't just equate them across the board. And there's only one unit, so it doesn't really matter which activity you're doing. You don't know how they'll be used, but you'll be given a unit. But that means that something that's extremely cheap, like soil carbon, is cheap because it's unreliable and it's low quality. That would be equated with something extremely expensive, like direct air capture, which is expensive because it's high quality. And so this proposal is completely losing track of the fact that not all of these removal technologies and practices lead to the same thing from a physical point of view, from an atmospheric science point of view. And there's a good reason for that, because they are just different in quality. And that's just completely ignored. And I wonder if this will actually help incentivize high quality removals in Europe at all, because the focus will be on the cheap, low quality stuff if it continues like this. And the high quality stuff will just be ignored because it's too expensive. And that's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be really focusing on high quality removals, making them happen, even if they are more expensive.
My thanks to Wijnand for coming on the show. If you're interested in this topic, there is further reading from both Land and Climate Review and Carbon Market Watch in the episode blurb below. If you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe or follow us on whichever podcast platform you use, and we will be back again in a fortnight. Thanks for listening.